So the four things I want to give to you is, I think, Megan, you've already talked about kind of the purpose of child assessments. So I'll just put a button in a couple of them, which is obviously assessments have a purpose. And I saw the Menti and I participated in the Menti. And so, yes, is data is informative, but also there's challenges with it, right? We know we get to see children's development over time and across spaces and settings. We get to see the areas of strength that children have and the areas that need strengthening. It also helps, I mean, when done well with the right measures, it can help, educators and professionals be able to create a classroom instructions that align with children's needs. You can see, children's growth over time. It can also evaluate programs, including our pre-K programs and other kinds of interventions and services. So there's a lot of good to assessments. But it's also some things that are not so good. And I'm probably going to focus on the things that are not so good. But we also do have to recognize that a lot of our assessments, at least that we use for the most part, especially in our early childhood programs, pre-K included, including, one of the networks that Megan and I have been a part of since 2016, I think, funded by the feds, by the Department of Education. We focus on language and literacy, including vocabulary. We focus on numeracy, social emotional development of different kinds, and a growing sense now of science, executive function, approaches to learning. But the question I have as we think about assessments, have we done enough in terms of constructs, in terms of measures? So when Megan asked me about talking about, giving a couple of remarks, the first thing that came to my head was there's this paper. I encourage all of y'all to read it. It's a 1996 paper, one of my favorites, by Cynthia Garcia Cole and colleagues. And it's a paper that basically is titled An Integrative Model for the Study of Developmental Competencies in Minority Children. If you don't have access to it, email me and I'll send it to you. It's a child development paper, and it has all of the great thinkers. And the reason that always comes to my mind is that there's a figure in that paper where they talk about the competencies of ethnic minority children. And they go beyond the typical cognitive, social, and emotional, but they get into the other pieces like linguistic competence, right? It's one thing to be able to speak, say, school English, but what about the kids who sort of speak school English, but then they have their own home English, or they merge their language systems together, right? So they mentioned that. They talk about biculturalism, right, as another competency. The fact is that some kids are having to kind of go through different cultures, whether it's a school culture, whether it's their home culture, whether it's their neighborhood culture, that children are having to go between multiple worlds, and they make it seem like it's seamless, but it is not, right? If you come from an environment where that's not like your school, you're having to figure out that environment. And that takes a level of cognitive capacity and competence that we never think about. We just think, oh, you drop the kids off at school and it's all good. No, they have to adjust. And then the other thing that they actually talk about, and this is in 1996, the year I graduated from high school, by the way, do the math. They talk about coping with racism. Right? Like, we never ever think about what does it mean for a child to cope with racism and or biases in the classroom. We just think it's just nothing, right? So they talk about that. So to me, it's a little bit thinking about outside the box. So this paper to me was ahead of their time, but it was also written by brilliant researchers. So this means that we have to look at whether all of our child assessments are really grounded in the lenses, the strength, the competencies, the capacities of our children, especially our historically marginalized children. And is it really capturing the true and critical aspects of our children's development? Again, I'm not arguing throw the baby out with the bathwater. I'm not saying get rid of your language and your cognitive and your vocabulary. I'm not arguing that. But what I am arguing is that we have to attend to whether our assessments have been so narrow and so white normative and so middle class normative that we have really basically whitewashed it, right? And so this paper really says we need to go deeper about the assessments that we're talking about. And then second, have we attended to the harms that some of these assessments have created, especially when we think about how we assess children who have disabilities, right? There's an incident happening that I'm a part of where the child had ADHD and the teachers gave an assessment, and then they said this child cannot matriculate into the next grade. But the question now is, did you do it in a way where the child had the medication? Did you do it in a universal design way? Was it done in the morning, the afternoon? So how do we do assessments in a way that really honors the brilliance and the gift of that child? What about dual language learners? What about children who speak a different variety of English, right? I'm gonna give y'all a secret. A lot of Black kids speak African-American English. It is a language system. It's not your regular, oh, they don't know how to speak English. It is a language system. But we never honor the fact that Black children actually speak a different language system. And so we just act like you just don't know the word. No, they know the word. They just have a different version of it that we've never actually acknowledged. So we have to think about that. And then the third part about the assessment piece is that we have to understand that even during the process of assessment, there's a thing called stereotype threat, right? Claude still talks about when you have been drinking the Kool-Aid of American racism and bias, even as a young child, right? You think that you are not as good. And so when you're taking any kind of assessment, you may feel like I'm not good enough. And that actually suppresses and depresses your assessment. So I think we need to think through just the whole idea of not just the assessment, but how the assessment is done. And then my last sort of piece I want to kind of touch on is sort of the idea of the assessment enterprise, right? So in a paper, colleagues and I wrote in the Journal of Education, and we really sort of push against this whole idea of the achievement gap, right? The idea of the assessments and how it's done. Again, we're not saying get rid of it, but we are saying that you have to take into account a systemic focus. You can't just think of an assessment as just the child's ability, that there's other things in there. So one, we sort of say the problem with sort of the enterprise of the assessment enterprise is the following, that really the assessment sets white children as the ideal. Who says the white children are the ideal, right? And why not other groups of children of color? It elevates Eurocentric standards as the only way, right? If you remember eugenics, that movement is sort of making a way back. How do we make sure that we're not elevating so the Eurocentric standard is the only one? It ignores Black children's competencies, but also arguably Native children's competencies, Latino children's competencies, and other children of color, including neurodiverse children with different ability and disability. And the paradigm, the assessments in of themselves are flawed. They're not a perfect tool, right? They're narrowly focused on given specific discrete skills. Are they capturing the fullness of children? And then the fifth thing is that it numbs us to Black children, Latino children, Native children's education underperformance. And what I mean is that when teachers hear anything about the achievement gap, they're like, oh, it's those children's problem. But when they hear about it as a systemic inequity problem, it's a different conversation. So I think as we think about assessments and then we think about sort of the achievement gap sort of things, we need to begin to really unwrap that. So what does that mean in moving towards the equity in assessments? Here's kind of, I'll give you my four big chunks. And of course, I have more to say, but I'll just leave it there to give time for us to kind of go into conversations. So I've already listed 5 big problems from like the standards, the white children's ideal, all that kind of stuff. So what do I think we need to do? One is that I think we have to really recognize, and I think really be explicit about the long reach and the impact of structural racism. I think we cannot ignore any longer that it is literally the air we breathe. It is the water that we drink. And that means if we're drinking it as adults, our kids are drinking it before they're born and they keep drinking it, and it has implications on assessment. So we have to really understand the impact of structural racism, but also biases in the assessment enterprise. Assessments, pre-K included, pre-K assessment, all of them, they're an enterprise in of themselves, right? There are people making money. There's a lot in that. So we have to understand the enterprise itself from the creation to the implementation, right? And we can't continue to tie outcomes to children without thinking about the social cultural histories, the context, and please don't blame parents, right? So let's also, I'm gonna make sure we are clear that this is not about parents who are not always doing their job. So we need to really think about the long reach. The second is that, we can't set white children as that ideal, but we have to recognize the genius, right? This is Acer Hilliard, right? Who has transitioned, but the ideal, and really it's actually W.E. Du Bois who actually said this, the ideal, right? That children are genius in themselves. And we have to use assessments as a guide rather than a way to implicitly or explicitly track children, right? So we have to use assessment in a way that is honoring of children's gift, because every child has a gift. That's why the idea of even gifted and special education is one we should even think about as an entity, but that's a different conversation. So we have to use assessment not as a way to track children, even implicitly, like who gets to be in this reading group with a teacher, who gets to read this book. We need to make sure that we're attentive to how we're using assessments to make judgments, even implicitly. We must elevate the competencies of minoritized population, right? So we know, for example, Black children's strength, one of the strengths that they have many, by the way, is oral language. We see this also with other populations, but for Black children in particular, oral language storytelling is their thing. They can tell you a story from beginning to end with details, with brilliance, with light, with color. And we don't actually recognize that in any of our educational assessments in our systems. We also know that social emotion regulation. Imagine being in a classroom where you know a teacher doesn't like you, right? Because kids can feel teachers, but they're able to still come to school, engage, do the lessons, do all that. So how about social emotion regulation? Or even as I mentioned earlier, being able to cope with racism and bias and injustices, right? Kids who are multilingual, multidialectical, who speak different, even a different variation of English, which a lot of kids of color, Black kids specifically, also do, right? Children who are bilingual and dual language learners, they're having to negotiate a whole lot of things in a monolingual country, a monolingual space, a monolingual setting, right? And then critical consciousness, right? So we need to elevate other competencies that, again, we think is going to be important, not just for pre-K, but gets them through life, especially in a life that is racialized based on your race, your gender, your ability, your class. So we need to prepare children for the real life. And then finally, we must create more expansive ways to assess children's skills, right? So that means now we have to look at the actual function, the actual ways we gather assessments, right? Most of the time we're doing some sort of direct assessments. That's fine, maybe, right? But what are other ways like observations? Some of our measures are observations. What about feedback from parents, right? I know we're like, oh my goodness, parents are biased. No, but I know my kids better than a teacher. I'm sorry, right? So I think we need to think about if we're going to really bring parents' voices, where does it situate in the assessment? And here in North Carolina, we try to do they're doing something like that, the K-2 assessments, right? And what about using different technology, verbal, written? And in the end of it, we have to create the condition for children to be able to elevate their genius. Because every child is a genius and we have to figure out how to elevate that. And then finally, we have to recognize the diversity and ensuring that it is inclusive, especially for children who may be neurodiverse, but also neurodiverse and Black, neurodiverse and dual language learner. So that really is my sort of call to us, that we have to think about racism. We have to not set white children as the ideal. We must elevate other competencies that really shows the genius and brilliance of children. And we have to create different, inclusive, expansive, culturally grounded ways of assessments. So I'll stop there with my 10 minutes, Megan. I hope I didn't go over my 10 minutes.
No, that was great. Thanks, Iheoma. Much appreciated. And obviously lots to think about there and what you just shared with us. I just have one kind of follow-up question, and then I was going to open it up for the group discussion. So if folks have questions, you can put them in the chat, or you can directly chat them to me or Laura, and folks will ask them. So I guess this is a question about kind of your ideal world. In your ideal world, building on what you just said, what would equity-centered assessments that can really strengthen students' experiences in classrooms look like?
I mean, so for me, I think what it will look like is that, as I think some of the remarks I made, I think one is that we really hone in on, first of all, what is the purpose for the assessment? And because in the end of it, if you don't know the purpose of an assessment, trust me, somebody will find a way to make it not good for particular groups of people. I can just tell you point blank, just like every system, people want a different system for somebody. If you're going to create something, it's probably going to make sure that for the most part, Black children are going to look not that great. Native children are not going to look that great, right? Children who speak a different language. So I think we need to figure out what is the purpose first and foremost. The second is that I would want us to elevate the competencies of the brilliance and the genius of our children of color. In the end of it, white children get a message that they're brilliant. That's just, it is what it is, right? But I think we have to begin to say, we know that there's a lot of brilliance in our Black children, in our Latino children, in our other children of color, and we have to make that much more visible. So that means that I'm going to say, hey, measurement assessment developers, what is your construct? What is your theory of frame? What is your theory of mind, right? What are you coming from? And so to me, it's not even about the assessments alone. It's about who is creating the assessments. Because to me, it's actually the whole enterprise, right? Assessment in of itself is not the issue, is the enterprise. So before you even begin the development, who is in the room? Who gets to decide what indicators go there? What is the sort of the constructs being developed? And are there other people in the room who are diverse? This is why, to me, we can't just continue to just take things that are packaged and not question who developed it. Like, I think that to me is almost like the critical part. Like, we need to make sure that people in the room developing the assessments are diverse on many levels, including racially, culturally, linguistically, and they understand that in a very visceral sense. And they also understand how racism and biases is permeating that. So for me, to even get to that, you have to address the actual construction of the assessment, so the whole enterprise. And then, of course, if that happens, then it's a likelihood that all the competencies of children of color will also be elevated along with the current versions we have, which actually really elevates white children and the way that they function, at least as a whole.